Hi, let's continue this look at the 5 main factors in causing bipolar, at least as we now understand them. If you're new or lost, you can go to the table of contents. So this was the first look at these in the introductory video, and this one will look at inflammation in the gut and the brain. You might think of inflammation like this, or maybe a subtle version like this, or maybe something you can't see but you can feel, like my sore elbow from playing too much pickleball. And you may know that there are chemicals, so-called inflammatory factors, that go into the bloodstream and circulate through the body from a site of inflammation. And the first discovery that's relatively recent is that these can make their way to the brain, causing mood symptoms and what's now called neuroinflammation. The second recent discovery is that there's a whole set of bacteria in our gut, the microbiome, and that these can secrete or cause to be released inflammatory factors, and these these too can reach the brain. Some people with bipolar have high levels of inflammatory factors, not everyone. But for example, among people who are hospitalized with a manic episode, the level of their inflammatory factors in their bloodstream predicted their probability of being rehospitalized in the next 6 months. So higher levels of inflammatory factors, higher chances of being rehospitalized, having another manic episode. Now, of course, that makes people think about treatment, because is there a way to lower these inflammatory factors, and that's, in this case, some that were coming from the gut? Can we treat this like with a probiotic? Well, the team that found this went ahead and did that. They put together a pill containing these particular 2 bacteria, and so kind of a probiotic pill, and compared it versus a group who were getting a same pill with nothing in it, placebo. So a little tricky the way this is graphed out. Everyone starts out well. We're looking at the rate of relapse into another manic episode. So this is the percentage of people who are not rehospitalized, because everybody was not rehospitalized to start. In other words, if, say, for example, 25% of people in the 5 months of this study were rehospitalized, 25%, it would look like this. And here are the results. The placebo group had a rehospitalization rate of 50%. 50% not rehospitalized, 50% hospitalized again. But the probiotic group, 25% rehospitalized, half the rate. So astounding study, but 2 other studies like this were negative. They didn't find this big wide separation, but those used a different probiotic and they had a different population. People were not as ill. So the jury is out on this, exactly what to make of all this, but it sure is tantalizing to look at this particular study and its result. Indeed, the idea is sufficiently alive that a Swedish team is now studying aspirin to see if it reduces the rate of bipolar relapse. So in summary, inflammation in the body coming from the gut or elsewhere reaches the brain and causes so-called neuroinflammation, which is thought to be part of causing bipolar. Now, there's one more related study if you can stand it. Otherwise, you could skip to the end and move on. But this really changes, or should change, how we think about the treatment of bipolar. And it's related, so I'm going to walk you through this one too. We know that overweight is related to inflammation, and inflammation is related, as we were just looking, with bipolar symptoms. So here's a study where one group gets way better. This is people with bipolar depression. And as you can see, in a relatively short period of time, that blue group is doing way better. They dropped their depression scores relative to the other group. So what was the treatment here? Well, everyone started out overweight and insulin resistant. Insulin resistance is it leads to diabetes. It's sort of like pre-diabetes. Your body is no longer able to handle glucose and get it into cells. And so more insulin is pumped out to trying to do that. Your body is getting resistant to that insulin. So everybody started out insulin resistant. The blue group were the ones who were able to undo their insulin resistance. In other words, getting uninsulin resistant was associated with a big drop in depression scores. It was so big that it's basically the same size as the kind of reduction in depression scores achieved with lurasidone, which is now recognized to have an antidepressant effect in bipolar depression. In other words, this is big. So how did they decrease the insulin resistance? They used a medication that's been around for a long time called metformin. But the point here is that this demonstrates that insulin resistance can cause, or at least is associated with, bipolar symptoms to the point where decreasing insulin resistance can decrease bipolar symptoms. So we're thinking about the mechanism of bipolar symptoms, insulin resistance looking like by the size of that reduction in scores, definitely involved. So if insulin resistance can cause inflammation, which is clear from other work, and inflammation is associated with bipolar symptoms, maybe this is the pathway. So what would we conclude then from this? And then I'll wrap up. Well, at minimum, we would conclude don't cause insulin resistance, which some of our treatments for bipolar do, the so-called atypical antipsychotics of my generation. The newest ones do this less, but the ones that I used a lot cause insulin resistance. So it's like, oh no, that's exactly what we don't want to be doing at this point. And we need to be thinking about other ways to treat bipolar without using those medications as often as possible. And it also makes us think there are other ways to decrease insulin resistance. A Mediterranean diet, the so-called ketogenic diet, which is kind of more challenging to actually do, but very dramatic results that you would see in the other video about metabolism. And something called time restricted eating, also known to decrease insulin resistance, and also being studied for the treatment of bipolar. Actually, in a head-to-head study in Berkeley, time restricted eating versus Mediterranean diet. In other words, the team believes that each of these is sufficiently powerful that they deserve to be compared with one another. So really exciting. And this all comes out of thinking about how does overweight and insulin resistance, possibly, quite probably through inflammation, lead to bipolar, and obviously these ways of reversing that pathway. So from here you can go to the rest of the playlist on causes of bipolar or back to the table of contents. Thanks for watching.